I'm Matt Zepperman. I used to be Zimmerman. I changed my name when I got married, so it's actually wrong in your schedule, so you can cross that out and change it. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow here at NIMBioS. In a few weeks, I'm transitioning to ASU, where I'll be a postdoc in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change, and I'll be working with Sarah Matthew there and doing some mathematical modeling and fieldwork with the Tricana pastoralists on warfare questions. Before I started graduate school, I went to UC Davis and was working there on modeling gene culture, coevolution, and cooperation. I was an officer in the US military, and it was hard for me not to interpret things I saw as an officer in the military from this perspective of cooperation. And I got interested in the question of this puzzle of human warfare. This is a specialist, I think Taylor Ryan. He ran out of his bunk dressed in his boxer shorts when their forward operating position was attacked by some Taliban insurgents, and basically he didn't put on any of his battle gear and went out to engage the enemy, which is a pretty risky thing to do when you're having mortars and heavy weapons fired at you. Here is Stalingrad, the largest military engagement in world history. Resulted in about 2 million or so, mostly Russian, but also a lot of German casualties, which just gets at this massive scale that humans are willing to fight and die at a lot larger scale than, say, chimpanzee warfare. And so what I got into this question is, how do you explain this, that humans take this high risk, are willing to take this high risk in warfare in really large groups with really low genetic readiness within the groups? And so my PhD advisor told me at one point to pick a discipline, and I had two that I was trying to choose from, and I hung out with both groups who are represented here. Evolutionary anthropologists tend to think about warfare in small-scale societies. They tend to think about this collective action problem a lot, which you've heard a lot about today. Acephalous just means there isn't a lot of a centralized authority that's running the groups. International relations, they tend to think about large-scale societies, state level normally, with hierarchical organization, where the collective action problem is just assumed to be solved. It's like the hierarchy has solved the collection action problem. However, there is a lot of interesting modeling going on here, and some of them, which I need to talk to Kim about, gets really at this question about why would you fight instead of just trade or bargain over things. That's dominates the international relations modeling literature, which I think is interesting. But I'm going to talk about mostly this collective action problem aspect. This is going to be a brief outline of this paper recently published, Sarah and I published in Evolutionary Anthropology. I'm just going to go through, and basically we're arguing that you need to think about group structure and cultural selection and understanding large-scale human warfare, where large-scale is something of 3 dozen or more, 3 dozen to 10 million, which is anything smaller than that we're calling small-scale warfare. Group structure, cultural selection, there's 2 things you need. You need group structure, which just means that you need individuals in groups where the social actions within the group are different than others. So in Richard Wrangham's example would be a chimpanzee community would be an example of a group where insiders have different interactions with outsiders. And we're talking about cultural transmission as opposed to genetic transmission. So this is traits that are passed through social learning from individual to individual as opposed to from genetic transmission from parents to offspring. I'm going to talk about briefly why you need these things. So I'm going to give an example of unstructured selection. Here you have cooperators and defectors. Cooperators do things that are great for the group, give the group some benefits, or at least other individuals benefits. Defectors free ride and don't give any benefits. And if you just run selection on something simple, say they're playing Prisoner's Dilemma games, defectors eventually take over and cooperation goes away. This is just unstructured selection. If you put individuals into groups, the idea is that you might have some groups that have more cooperators and some that have more free riders. And if groups are competing, and for whatever reason, the traits of the groups that do better, that cooperate more, tend to spread, you can get cooperation spreading between groups. And I'll talk a little bit about different ways this can happen. And with genetic selection, this in biology is thought to be very weak, not supposed to work very well. And the reason why is migration tends to break it down. So you have some gene flow or individuals migrating between groups, or you have a mutation, and a cooperator gets into a defecting group, a defector gets in a cooperating group. That happens a couple of times, and eventually any between group differences go away, and everything just becomes individual selection dominating within the group. So migration, just really mathematically, really small amounts of migration break this down. Choi and Bowles, which some people have talked about today, have probably the most, they really tried hard to get this to work, genetic group selection, right? And so they have a model, basically upper right here is warfare, lower left is not warfare. And they do these agent-based models. These are just groups over time. They're populating this. groups kind of, warfare and peace kind of go back and forth. They have kind of, some people talk about this today, they have kind of unrealistic genetic differentiation between groups. And they have a group extinction rate that's really high. And essentially, the largest they can get this to work with is 26 individuals in a group, which is very small compared to a lot of human warfare. If you up this to 40, you can go on on Sample's website and run these simulations and put in your own parameters. If you go up to 40, warfare disappears. So genetic group selection doesn't seem to work very well. What cultural group selection does is that if you have this kind of migration or learning between groups, it turns that most groups, people tend to conform within their group, or you have punishment that reinforces group norms, and it keeps this kind of dilution of between group differences from going down. And so it's thought that cultural group selection can be a lot stronger. In this paper, I'm going to go briefly through this stuff, but in this paper we argue that warfare meets the necessary and sufficient conditions for cultural group selection, being that groups that tend to have traits that help them win wars tend to win. And when you win, your cultural traits tend to spread to other groups, or you tend to take over other groups. Those are necessary. If you have those things are true, cultural group selection or group structure cultural selection has to happen. And these are just, we go through 3 different types of cultural traits that seem to matter in war success. And I think we ended up with 5 different ways that group success can influence the spread of traits. A lot of people tend to focus on this top one and think that all group selection models have to have group extinction in them. Those are definitely, they'll work the strongest in that case, but there's lots of different mechanisms that can cause this. And often the math doesn't really care which one. And we have lots of, we crammed as many empirical examples in the paper as evolutionary anthropology would let us, so they're all in there if you want to see them. All right. Mostly what I want to talk about today is alternative models, and I'm just going to give like 4 of the kind of other ways people have thought about warfare from an evolutionary perspective and why they don't really work very well without cultural group selection. The first is reciprocity. Reciprocity is I'm nice to you, you're nice to me. Tit for tat, for those of you that have read Axelrod. One thing, and I review this literature in this paper, recent paper, one thing about reciprocity is that it can stabilize cooperation in some cases, but it can also stabilize just any other behavior that you want it to. There's nothing really special about cooperation. As group size increases, it just doesn't work very well. If you are playing n-person games with more than 2 players, if you get up to 4 or 5 players, it just falls apart and reciprocity no longer works. And, but if you embed reciprocity in a cultural group selection or group structure cultural selection model, then you can get cooperation to evolve and you can select for cooperative equilibria. Punishment and rewards. This also can stabilize any trait. It can stabilize necktie wearing. Different disciplines have different styles of dress that are stabilized within their discipline. Their proximate mechanisms. One thing that they do is that they're proximate because there's an nth order, what's called an nth order cooperation problem, which is if you're punishing or rewarding, someone has to pay the cost of that punishment and rewarding. And if you say that punishment and rewards solve the problem of warfare, for example, then you have to solve the problem is why are people rewarding those that go to war or punishing those that don't, which is costly. And you just basically kick the can down the curb a little bit. And if you just take, it's hard to do by itself, but if you plug it in a group structure cultural selection model, you also get something that favors punishment and rewards, which then can favor warfare. Costly signaling is something else that's been proposed. Again, costly signaling can stabilize any behavior, not just cooperative behaviors. Modeling suggests that the signals that have high broadcast efficiency, meaning that it's really easy to see if someone is paying that costly signal, are things that tend to be selected by evolution. And we argue in the paper that warfare doesn't really have this property. That it's not, there's a lot of other signals that are available that can broadcast that I'm paying a cost, like wearing a big crazy hat and walking around in it would do that more. I have 1 minute left. Again, you can put in this cultural group selection model, which Gintis, Smith, and Bowles did in 2001. And the last one is the mismatch hypothesis. And the idea here is that, I had a different slide. All right, the idea here is that that humans may have evolved up here where there's lots of warfare. And then somehow over time, they had the rules they learned up in there, when they're over in this section, they apply to very large groups of 40 to 300 million people. The problems with this, there's no real mechanism to explain why we're misapplying something that explicitly evolved to recognize and benefit kin to large groups of non-kin. Kim has this great paper from a few years ago about this low evidence that hunter-gatherers were close kin. And we also tend to know who our kin are. Like, I don't think any of you are really that closely related to me, and I can tell that. So I don't seem really fooled. I might still go to war for you. I probably did. Okay, and then okay, and so the last part of this is the psychological aspect. There's been a lot of debate in the literature about whether humans involved in societies like this, where there's a lot of warfare going on, or down here where there's a lot of peace. In Choi and Bowles' model, things kind of fluctuate back and forth between warfare and peace. Our argument is that, applying to warfare, is that it would make a lot more sense if you're born as a human being and there's a lot of fluctuation back and forth instead of picking one or the other. One second. Is that you go and you learn what's going on in your group and you adopt the cultural traits that are in your group, which is what drives cultural group selection. That's it. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody else. The paper's on the website.